Welcome, everyone. Today, we kick off the first of our 2024 Past Summer Camp series with Achieving Clarity in Your Comprehensive School Safety Plan. I'm Les Nichols. I am a member of the Past Technical Committee, and I will be our moderator today. Today, our underlying theme is also leadership in school safety, and we could not have two better presenters for this critical area. First, Kevin Wren. Kevin is a national leader in school security and director of business development for A3 Communications Incorporated, a leading provider of IT and security solutions. Prior to this, Kevin was active in school security and emergency management for over 20 years as a school resource officer and director of security, risk, and emergency management. Kevin also gained over $15 million in grant funding for his schools, all of which led him to being named National Campus Security Director of the Year by Campus Safety Magazine. Kevin is also a member of the Past Technical Committee, an advisor for Safe and Sound Schools, an advisor to the U.S. Department of Education's Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center, known as RIMS-TA, and an advisor to ASIS International. We're also fortunate to have Paul Timm. Paul is a nationally acclaimed expert in school security and director of safety education for Allegion, a global leader in access control technology. Paul is the author of School Security, How to Build and Strengthen a School Safety Program, and the host of the Changing Face of School Security podcast. Paul was named one of the most influential people in security in 2020 by Security Magazine. In addition to conducting more than 2,000 vulnerability assessments and being a frequent keynote speaker, Paul serves on the Past Technical Committee, the ASIS School and Security Community, and the Campus Safety Conferences Advisory Board. We've also included a period at the end of their presentation for questions and answers. Want to remind you to submit any questions through the chat box, and our team will forward these over to the speakers to be able to answer. If we don't have time to get to your question, we will follow up with an email with an answer to that. And so with that, gentlemen, I will turn this over to you.
Thanks, Les. Greatly appreciated. And of course, Max, we know that you're doing such unsung heroic work in the background. Thank you for that as well. We want to, for your viewing pleasure, overwhelm you with what we call at Past the bubble slide. And there's more bubbles here than tapioca that you would find in a bubble tea. And we're going to break all of this down for you, but we thought it at least sets the stage for the variety of different things that you will find in your initial pursuits of putting together comprehensive school safety. So assemble the team, navigating systems and complexity, and then plan, prepare, practice is of course the path that we're going to be on as we unfold this roadmap in front of you. And so having said all of that, I'm going to begin with this particular slide, the one about it taking a team. And I'm going to just put all of this up here for you on the screen and let you know that in general, we know that a school must have a safety planning team. And in many of those cases, the security director will be the one who heads up that team. Now, because I have Kevin with me and he was a school security director of the year, I want to just ask you, Kevin, there are times that we find that the security director is not heading up the safety planning team. Who else might be candidates that we see that would head up a team like this?
Yeah, absolutely. Not every, unfortunately, not every school district is able to afford a security director, and And Lord knows we can have the conversations about the differentials between credentials between those that can afford a security director and their roles and responsibilities. But at the end of the day, we know a lot of people that play this central role of security director are also the transportation director, the facilities director, the CFO in a lot of cases. So it does appear to me, though, that most of the time the security directors fall in that operational side of the house, not so much on the academic side of the house, which obviously there's pros and cons to both of those. Um, the bubble chart here, Paul, I'm a huge fan of it. I definitely challenge all the people that are attending to look at that and think, who's missing? Who else should we add? What does your team look like, or is it a team of one who's just making it up as they go, so to speak, or do we actually have a multifaceted, all hazard stakeholders coming together for this one vision, one path of a security management plan?
I like the community off to the right, if you look at that, including law enforcement and fire, parents and students and media. I like that because in many of the safety planning teams that we see, we find that parents and especially students are excluded. Many times students are considered to be the ones who are most likely to disrupt our safety plan. And I like to, every time that concern is raised, I like to remind people that the vast majority of students are in favor of a safe learning environment. So let's bring students on board. They are going to be, first of all, ahead of us in technology, except for maybe Kevin, because he's so great. But they're also going to have a much better pulse of what's really going on in and around the school, including all the way into the social media arena. Occasionally
Yeah.
with community, we will also say, let's involve our outside organization. That might be Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or the church group that rents the gymnasium or the auditorium, whatever it might be. They do have a view of the school from a different angle. And of course, all the way to the inclusion in things like drills, which we'll talk about later, they should be involved. But I really, the community one, very helpful. And then as we rotate clockwise and look at the admin section, the integration team, and IT, all of those are vital components. And anytime I think of the word vital, of course, I think of you, Kevin, but I really wanted you to talk, if you would, about the integration team, because you've been able to see all of how this works, not only as a security director, but as somebody who's with an integrator. Talk to us a little bit about the bullets and
Yeah,
integration.
absolutely. But before I jump into that, we'll highlight that student again. That is super important. Most of you guys know that I started doing school security when I was 15 as a student representative. We can spend $100,000, $1 million, $10 million on school safety and security products, and if it doesn't make the students feel any safer or actually make them safer, what are we doing? So I'm huge on the students, and I'm sure Paul will attest. The students, it doesn't matter what decade the students are in, they know of the issue. So Paul knew what was going on in the 50s. So the integration team is definitely key to making all of this bubble chart happen. Because at the end of the day, even if you're a full-time security director, IT director, you have so much on your plate. It is impossible for you to know all the technologies, all the things that are coming out, all the cutting edge systems that these manufacturers are coming out with. So that's where you've got to find a partner. The word vendor is on there, but I will say you've got to find a partner, somebody that is on the same page of music with you, that is going to go to bat for you, that somebody you would put your name on the line for because they are becoming a part of your team. I was at a large conference last week and had a gentleman tell me that there was a vulnerability with their access control card readers, which there is with proximity cards and you being able to buy a scammer that to where you can scan the card and then that person becomes you more or less. And he said when he found that vulnerability because a student did that, he called his integrator and the integrator said, I've been waiting for this phone call. That's a problem. That's not a teammate. Your teammate would tell you all the vulnerabilities, things to watch out for, things that are coming down the pipe, because that is their function. That is their job as an expert team member in this bubble silo. And let's face it, everybody that's listed on here, integration team, admin, community, IT, they all have their expertise to bring to the table around the topic of securing our schools.
Yes, and I know I skipped over admin as I moved to integration team. Thank you for bearing with me on that one, Kevin. On the administrative side, occasionally people will say, well, what about administrative assistants or facilities personnel? And they're in that category. You see staff there. You know, we don't want anybody left behind. We don't want cafeteria, whether they're in-house or outsourced, to be left behind. We want facilities and people who are seeing every element of the buildings and grounds to be involved. An administrative assistant, it's sitting on the front line and they must be fully involved with what we're doing. I will caution, on occasion, somebody says, well, I've put together a list of potential stakeholders for my safety planning team. And you look at the list and we're upwards of 40 people, you don't want to become so large and unwieldy that you'll never be able to really control that meeting. And then when we look back at the security director and see visionary, leader, manager, it's up to that person to really also facilitate in a way that makes this whole setup manageable. How about IT? Kevin, they're sort of the up and coming. In the past, maybe they were, and I'm saying this tongue in cheek, so let's not anybody be offended. Maybe we're in an ivory tower where they were running things, but more and more we've realized that they've got to be fully integrated into the safety planning team. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Analog technology is a dying breed. It's not being replaced. You can't find replacement parts. Everything is, you know, the IoT, right? Internet of Things. Everything is smart. You can't get away from technology in any part of your day. In fact, I think, what was that? Was that Friday last week where that was kind of proven out to where life shut down as we know it, right? With CrowdStrike. So IT is definitely has to be at the table. And if they're not at the table, we have a lot of issues. In fact, they're opening up vulnerabilities to the school district because you as a security director or facilities director, you're installing a lock that may be a smart lock. As soon as that lock, that camera, that whatever the technology is plugged into a switch, you now have a cyber vulnerability. And IT needs to be aware of those vulnerabilities so that they can mitigate any risks associated with anything coming onto the network. And then we start getting access into like the video management systems. A principal wants to see them from their house. They want to see them on their phone. They want to see them. And that's fine. And you can definitely make that happen. But IT's got to set up the VPNs. They got to make sure that they have the appropriate firewalls and all the protections in place to make sure that Johnny's not hacking into the network. To the network and giving themselves A's. And so IT is definitely a key component to what's happening. Also, too, I'll tell you that depending on how the network is set up, the statement of school safety and security is our #1 priority. There's plenty of educators and probably people on this line that'll make that statement. And that's just not true. Our #1 priority is to educate students. Right. And if we add a whole bunch of cameras with a whole bunch of bandwidth and crash the network of the students that are trying to learn, we've got a huge issue. So again, IT is imperative to have a seat at this table to know and understand what the implications are for the different devices and systems that are coming onto their network. Maybe not today, but it will be there in the future.
Yeah, and if one of my favorite security directors was on this call, Jason Stoddard, he would tell you The advent of artificial intelligence isn't necessarily something that has just begun. It's just becoming far more prominent in everything that we're doing in technology. And what we want to make sure here is that a security director and other stakeholders are not living in fear of artificial intelligence. If you don't feel like you fully grasped everything, this is a collaborative approach. And one of the things I say often is nobody has shoulders broad enough to carry the whole safety program by themselves anyway. That's why we are commending to you this collaborative approach. Before I move to the next slide, I wanted to say one more thing, and then I'll give you a chance to have the last word on this slide, Kevin. But sometimes people will say, how often will the safety planning team get together, and how long should meetings be? And while we can't answer that question, because if you've seen one school, you've seen one school, generally we think there probably should be a safety planning team meeting each semester, and that meeting, if we're doing things correctly, should probably not exceed 1 hour. What we don't want to become is the board meeting that has no definite end to it. And so put together a clear agenda, make sure that the prioritized items are first. If we don't get to everything in that amount of time, we can then table it for the next meeting. But that's the best way to stay organized in a process like this. Kevin.
Yeah, and Paul, you said earlier too, about, the cafeteria staff and day porters, and they have super value. When I was a school resource officer, if I wanted an immediate, pulse on what's happening in that school, you talk to two people, cafeteria staff, day porter, they know and see and hear everything, and then checking all the wonderful graffiti in the bathrooms, and that would give me a pretty good idea of what that school climate was. So all these every employee has value into creating this plan, but you can't overwhelm it. I also want to say that we're not telling you to create a completely separate team. You already have something like this. Maybe not all the specific stakeholders, but you have something similar, whether that's a school improvement council team, a risk management team. There's some kind of behavioral threat assessment team. There's some kind of team that already has a good portion of these stakeholders. So we're just saying, hey, add a couple here and do this security specific meeting, like you said, at least once a semester. I will say this too. So there's kind of two big ways that I've had success of getting all the input from all of the stakeholders. One, you can do a survey. I use a tool like SurveyMonkey. Send out a survey asking questions, rank order this, different matrices. I will caution you, don't ask an open-ended question to a school district that has 2,500 employees. It is very hard to read 1,500 statements about your security plan. And then the other thing is doing focus groups. So having open community focus group sessions where people can come in and really dive into the different areas of school security, and using the past guidelines kind of to help you narrate that process. Those are two ways that I've been able to get success for bringing in all the stakeholders to be able to share their views. But with this session being where to start, you need to identify those teammates inside your district that y'all are going to be on the same sheet of music, y'all are going to sing the same song, and they're going to be as passionate about school security as you are. I'll tell you, my last district, believe it or not, my school nursing director, my director of school psychology, and my procurement director, in addition to my facilities director, those four were probably the biggest champions of me helping put a team together.
Good. I appreciate that. As we move to the second slide of our three main slides, we want to talk about a variety of physical security, primarily items and systems, and the need for integration. And I don't know, Kevin, because you're so much younger than me, if you'll remember this, but Security Magazine came out with a cover article years ago that said 3 reasons not to integrate. And the whole gist of the article was, please, as much as possible, integrate. In fact, there's only three reasons we could ever think of to not integrate, whereas there's 1,000 reasons to integrate. And I know everybody is trying to head in this general direction when we've got everything. And we'll start at the top with access control and move clockwise again. We've got everything from access control, which we're talking about electronic access control here, intrusion detection, which would be your burglar alarm systems, video surveillance systems, fire systems, and this is the one that is not necessarily physical security, but it is a system that is in operation with everything else. Visitor management software, and then as we think about system operability, which we'll come back to in just a minute, and then of course mass notification, mass communications, it's a lot of pieces to think about. And as you said, in the past, when we had largely analog systems, we also had maybe proprietary systems, and everybody is looking for open systems so we can begin to integrate. What kind of experiences did you have with that back in your district days?
Oh, I have to go way back then, huh? Now, so we were a couple of different things. My first district was there back in 06 or so, and it was the kind of the beginnings of IP cameras, right? And adoption of that. And if we look at where we were on the camera side with analog and then transitioning to IP, today basically everyone has IP cameras. Yeah, I'm sure there's probably 20-30% that are still on some analog, but vast majority of people are buying IP cameras and have changed out their older analogs for IP. So there's a lot of IP cameras back in 06 and projects around updating, going from, and I'm not a camera expert, but however many megabytes to, one gig, so where you can see a little better definition. And, if we think about the way cameras have changed from 06 to today and, what you can see and the bandwidth and all those things. And so back in 06, it was just kind of a newer technology. And then just making sure with, I think SIA has been a big driver of standards, right? Standard communication protocols on VIF for cameras and other things, but making sure that these companies are all following open protocols. And the reason we transition from analog to IP is we want them to be smart, right? And if we're smart and proprietary, then I can't get access to all the other data. I can't do all the complexities that are necessary for a response because I have all these different siloed out systems. So we go to IP because we want the smarts. So let's make sure that everybody's following open protocols so that we can attach through IO contacts or APIs or whatever it is, and bring all these disparate systems together to help ease the pain and the complexity of navigating incidents. We know when an incident happens at school, it doesn't matter if it's a fire or a tornado or an active shooter or what the scenario is. We know time is of the essence for emergency responders. They want real-time, assessments and to be able to quickly access data. We know parents, right? I'm a parent. You guys are grandparents, and we want to make sure that we have the information about what's happening at our schools, and they want it lightning fast because our cell phones dictate it. Social media dictates it. So how do we take all of these systems and combine them into one pane of glass, one push of a button? When it comes to response, I train a secretary or front office staff. I train them on how to recognize a threat, right? Lady comes in irate with a hammer. That's a threat. So what should you do now? Let's push one button and put the whole place into lockdown, notify law enforcement, give if a school district has a SOC or if 911 center has availability to the systems, making sure they have live, they know situational awareness of what's taking place from the response protocol. that one button could then also push the notifications to parents. You know, we have an incident, we're in lockdown, we're in, you know, whatever the protocol is, we're in that state. You know, please don't come to school. Law enforcement is on the way, so that parents are not worrying about what's going on and not flooding the school. They've got some kind of information, and they know information will be coming out after that, instead of sitting in the dark and then they make up their own narrative and the rumor mill starts flying.
Yep, and I'm going to just help define some of these acronyms along the way. SIA is the Security Industry Association. If you don't know anything about them, it's worth a look up at the end of this webinar. And SOC is Security Operations Center. Some will even call it a Physical Security Operations Center or a PSOC. Either way, your larger districts are going to have that right in there. If you're in a smaller district, you may say, well, man, we really don't. I am the Security Operations Center. And we understand there's issues with that. We also understand, and Kevin, I'm sure you've seen some of these things now, but there are artificial intelligence entities who are putting things together that can help assess something through the video surveillance and decide whether or not a threat is happening, and then begin to close things down through electronic access control, notify law enforcement and district through communications. And so I'm not saying you have to have AI, but it is coming, and it's coming fast to try to help put all of these things together. I want to add to this slide because what we have here is not yet complete. And I just want to caution everybody that whenever we're talking about these systems, we have to remember that there are fire codes and Americans with Disabilities Act standards and life safety codes that do have a large part to play. I like to tell people, as somebody who's based in Chicago, that it was 68 years ago that Our Lady of the Angels Catholic School burned to the ground and almost 100 people died. And after that, we as a society said, we can't let this happen again. Every school has to have a fire alarm system, and every school has to be built with fire retardant materials and have fire extinguishers. And we have to do fire drills to make sure that we're ready for these kinds of things. And a lot of times we forget about the value that all of those codes have brought into place. And we begin to say things like, well, then the classroom lock might not be enough. Let's add a second lock. The problem is it violates codes and standards like we've just put up there. And now we're potentially endangering people. I want to make one other qualification there. Sometimes people say, well, no one's dying in fires anymore at all. They're just not really a threat. And while the first part of that statement is true, the second part is most certainly not true. We haven't had any fatalities because the fire codes are working. And we can prove that because there are at least 3,000 fires in educational institutions every year in the US. And we are experiencing, unfortunately, burns, smoke inhalation, injuries, but no fatalities because fire codes are in place. What we would never want to do is jeopardize our fire safety that we have through so much rigor and discipline won over the years by compromising it with physical security items. Just a qualifier that I wanted to say there. What would you like to add to that, Kevin?
No, you're spot on. It drives me nuts when I hear people say, well, we hadn't had a fire death in, and then they name however many years, 50, 60, 100. Like it's a bad thing. Like, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Let's look at physical security in the same manner of fire. Is physical security hardening going to eliminate all deaths in schools? Absolutely not. It's not. But it'll help, right? And when some of these companies out there who I want to believe have a good heart and think they are doing the right thing, that surely they're not just a bunch of piranhas feeding on fear, that they just don't know about these other codes and things. And I think we just need to do a better job of educating all of those with a pure heart that, hey, while that sounds like a great idea, let me tell you all the other reasons on why that's probably not the best thing to do right now.
Yeah, education is the remedy for ignorance. And I do want to mention, as we're about to move to the next slide, sometimes people will say, well, you talk about life and life safety codes, fire codes, ADA laws. Why don't we have those things that apply to physical security? And I just want to say this, it is difficult to put them together, and yet we're on the cusp of it happening. ASIS International has a group of people that have been working now for well over a year to try to put together standards. Those standards, once complete, are going to go out for public comment. And again, much like SIA, the Security Industry Association, which is backing all of what ASIS International is doing, ASIS International as an association is trying to bring some kind of help as you are trying to put together your own physical security systems and products to make sure we're as effective as possible and as standardized as possible, with the qualification of knowing that many schools are unique in their setups.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Paul, one last thing here, because again, just as a reminder of we're talking about where to start. Right. So inside the PATH guidelines, and hopefully everybody on here has already uploaded and read them multiple times, maybe even memorized them as Paul has. I want to make sure that if we have $1 to spend on school security, we're spending it here first through to we have so much money we don't know what to do with ourselves. Right. I've unfortunately never worked for that district, but mass communications when it comes to this list, right? Mass communications is first and foremost. I cannot respond to an emergency if I don't know emergency is taking place. So whether that's overhead speakers, text messages, email alerts, visual messaging boards, all the above, mass communications needs to make sure that that is up and running before we're looking at installing weapons detection or cameras and things. We follow that up by using access control, which visitor management, some of your glass protections, your electronic access control, key control, all that kind of stuff falls in the access control component. Then we're looking at video surveillance and then alarms and analytics. So I just want to make sure that we look at that as far as where do we begin. Let's begin around communications, and even previous to that, we get into training and standards based off of policies and procedures.
Yes, and we want to remind people who have questions to put them in the chat. And we also want to remind our good and faithful moderator, Les, that you can interrupt us at any time. I do want to say, because Kevin brought up mass communications, we have people from all across the country on this webinar. Some of you are just being introduced to Alyssa's Law. And Alyssa's Law, of course, started in Florida and is going to mandate in the states where it's been passed that I, as a teacher or staff member, would have a way to be able to connect immediately with emergency responders should I encounter some kind of an emergency. That does affect how you do your mass notifications and your mass communication. So the reason we're bringing it up is when we're putting all of the pieces together, we want to make sure we understand what state mandates and requirements we're facing as well. In the state of Illinois, we don't have Alyssa's Law yet, but we do have requirements for other items, reporting items, emergency drill items, etc. Remember, as you're captaining the ship, to make sure that you're accounting for all of these areas.
Absolutely.
Paul, if I may, since you said as questions come up and talking about communications, we did receive a question that this might be a good place for this to fit in, and if not, we can move this to a little later. But what are the most commonly requested mass notification softwares you see on the educational market? Either one.
Well,
what do you see most requested out there?
So
that's a great question.
So I'll jump in kind of twofold here. One of the great things about Partner Alliance Safer Schools is we do not endorse any software manufacturer or any product. We're more around best practices, right? So
Yeah.
when we're looking at mass communications, in this solutions complexity bubble here, right?
Yes.
One, making sure that whatever you're doing is open platform, where, and again, IP based is where everything's going. So you have SIP, session initiated protocol, which is that common language with your voice over IP phone systems, and taking your phone systems and making sure that the kindergarten teacher either has a phone in the classroom, speaker in the classroom, something to where there's two-way communication to the front office, making sure that the kindergarten teacher, the custodian, the whomever is able to do an all page to put the building in lockdown and those types of things. So making sure that you have on-site mass communications from an audible and visual, because we have some ADA compliance issues there to look at as well. And then the notifications to parents and other external stakeholders for whatever the incident is that's taking place, because not every incident needs to have parents and law enforcement notified, right?
Yes.
99% of everything is just internal communications to the school.
Yes.
And,
You know,
and
I want to say this subject is already spawning more questions, so this is good.
Yeah.
You touched on Alyssa's, I think Paul may have.
Alyssa's Law. Mhm.
Yes. And there's a question, where is Alyssa's Law at the federal level?
Yes. Well, I will tell you this. Once it has been enacted on a federal level, we'll all know. Right now, it's state by state, and I can't remember the number of states that already have Alyssa's laws at 11 or 8 or so. I can't remember. But for sure, there's consideration at the federal level, and all I can say for sure is stay tuned. I do want to say one other thing before you get to the next question, Les, and that is something that Kevin brought up. If I'm a teacher, I should be reminded regularly about the importance in communications of redundancy. Sometimes I'll do a security assessment and they have what would be considered to be an old intercom call button system that's attached to their public address. And I'll find that occasionally teachers have even obstructed the access to those buttons because they have their new voice over IP telephone, they have their smartphone. And I like to remind people when I see that, first of all, let's make sure it's visible and accessible. You might not be the only one in this room, but second of all, if we lose Wi-Fi, your telephone may not work. And if there is a real incident and we can't get through on cellular, your smartphone won't work, and you'll be really glad to have a hardwired intercom call button system like that as well. The principle of redundancy, just like many of the things that we're talking about today, it has to be educated. Otherwise, we're going to learn because we didn't know and we had a bad situation and we experienced some loss. That's not the proper way of learning. Proactively is the proper way.
You know, on this same thing of communications, there's another question that came in. Someone asked to explain the difference, if there is one, between mass notification and mass communications. Those terms are probably thrown around sort of loosely by a lot of different people. Is there a distinction between those?
Kevin, you want to go first?
The answer may be no, Kevin, but is there a distinction between those?
I will definitely yield to Paul.
Okay, good. Here's what I would say. A mass notification generally refers to the way that we let everybody know that there is an incident occurring. And mass notification, as Kevin said, can apply to our parents. We're going to send a message out to all of them about something that's happening. And it can happen internally. We can also make it so it's going to happen both internally and externally. Mass communications is our public address system is mass communication, and we may use it for mass notification. So I think the term mass notification implies that everybody's going to have to get something. Mass communication, and I know there's going to be sticklers who say, Paul, you're saying the same thing here, but mass communication is generally, do we have systems in place that could get to wide swaths of individuals and groups? So in the
Yeah.
end, that's how I make the distinction.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I agree, mass notification, making sure that multiple stakeholders are notified. Mass communications is all the different ways to notify them. So your intercom system, your visual messaging boards, your text messaging, your student information system database, however you're pushing all the different messages inside of that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Can we
I'll
move
let
on?
you we had a few more questions, but I
Oh,
also
good.
don't want to
Let's go.
interrupt the flow of your,
Let's go.
if you want to move on.
No, let's take a
Okay,
couple.
good. This
Let's
is good.
be,
All right, there's another question in this same area regarding Alyssa's law. And someone asked, can you cover the original intent of Alyssa's law? Many vendors have used influence to expand it to include body-worn panic buttons. Was that the original concept of the law?
Okay, I'm going to use a Kevinism here. Kevin likes to say that Alyssa's law and the interpretation of it is like the Wild West. And while neither of us were there when it was enacted in Florida, so we're not going to be able to speak for those who had the intent or how it's morphed since then. I just would say this, you want to be as in step with your state as possible. And remember what we talked about here before, you want to make sure that you've got a collaborative approach to this so that your IT is weighing in, so your integration partner is weighing in, your administrators and staff and even understanding what they do and don't understand are weighing in. If we can't get to that point, it is really going to stay the Wild West. So be intentional, collaborative, and careful as you move forward with your interpretation and implementation.
Okay.
We know that every after action that's been done of every major incident, one of the number one things is communication or lack thereof, right? And at
Yes.
the end of the day, I believe that is Alyssa's law's intent, is trying to get quicker notification, easier notification to responders to get help to the school immediately. Now, there's issues. I remember having some conversations with some people in Florida, and I said, I don't understand. They're mandating a system that goes on a cell phone that you're going to have to pay for. Like, so you're telling me that just picking up my phone and dialing 911 doesn't meet the law? Like, so because it's two more buttons instead of the one. I'm like, this is odd to me. But we can't ignore the laws. The laws are there. We have to make sure that we are bringing that team together and making good common sense decisions about what we were doing and why we were doing it before we start purchasing systems to meet Alyssa's law, right?
I have
Yeah.
a question about this. Is it likely, if once this reaches the federal level, this was asked, Paul had asked, that might bring more clarity to this since there's so much variation?
I guess it's depends
Or is
on
it less likely to bring
depends on
clarity?
your view of the federal government. No, listen, we're all waiting to see. And you brought up something, and we're trying to steer clear of agendas here. But in that last question, they talked about wearables. They talked about the influence of state legislatures. We're apolitical. We're not taking a stance on any of those things. But certainly we're hoping. Alyssa's law is one of the laws, and please, everything that we've had up to this point you get to decide on your own. What's your video surveillance system going to look like? How many cameras are you going to have? All of the components that we list here, you've been able to decide. Alyssa's law is dictating some things, and that's for big time emergencies. And as time moves on, we're going to get better because people are going to make mistakes. That's not the way we want to learn. And that's why I think as we see it unfolded in state after state, if it's not been influenced by vendors, unless they've been ethical. The states are giving, and they've learned lessons from other states, are giving, I think, the arrow's pointing to the right direction on better and better direction on how to implement.
Now, okay, excellent.
Yeah.
I want to ask, there's another question from one of our colleagues asked, is there any association where school security directors can go to learn more and
Yep.
eventually
Yep.
certified as a school security professional? There's just so many
Yeah.
aspects that
And
the
I
person in
want to
that
thank.
role has to master. Where do they go?
Yep. And I listen, I thank whichever colleague that is. I did want to mention earlier, we have a brand new entity on the scene called the National Council for School Safety Directors, and NCSSD. And that is blazing a trail right now to help our security directors with tools and resources that will enable them to be more efficient and effective at their jobs, no doubt about it. If we could hold questions for just a moment, I'd like to make sure that we've covered this last of the three breakdowns of the bubble slide. And of course, what we're looking at here is something from a district-wide standpoint, the plan, prepare, and practice slide. This one is interesting because here again, we see a depiction of many stakeholders, whether external stakeholders like first responders, I'm sorry, emergency responders, or internal stakeholders like our teachers and staff who stand on the front line and really are going to be first responders. We have to take into account all of these groups, students, visitors, parents, to make sure they understand their roles, responsibilities, and training. And as we do this, I want to make sure that we also, giving credit to Michelle Gay and Safe and Sound School, she sends her greetings today. She has got a program because she lost a special needs daughter at Sandy Hook called Especially Safe. And as we think about any of these categories, we think about people of all abilities so that we can never imagine a scenario where anybody is left behind. So all of that comes under district control is the wrong word, but the district will roll out how we're putting these plans together so they're standardized across the district, how we're preparing our entities represented here on the slide, and then ultimately how we practice to make sure we're as ready as possible if an emergency takes place. And before I turn it over to you, Kevin, I just want to say this. We're also not talking about just active shooter incidents here. We all understand that's the soup du jour, but we really put emergencies into three buckets: our violence emergencies, and yes, active shooters a subset of that, our severe weather emergencies, and our medical emergencies. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, so plan, prepare, practice is just a reinvention of what we've done in emergency management world, right? Mitigation, prevention, respond, recover, kind of thing. So, the Partner Alliance of Safer Schools, we're physical security, right? Physical security best practices, but we also understand and know that it's not as simple as just physical security, that there's way more to it. And emergency management, crisis emergency management, there is a huge functionality here that has to exist, that we have to have plans in place and recognizing the risks. So again, where to start, right? So to start to prepare, we have to know what we're preparing for. So we have to do a risk management, right? We have to do a risk management assessment. The past guidelines and the checklist should help you in navigating that physical security risk management and have it to where you can rank yourself into which of the 4 tiers you're in. Ideally, you're tier 1 across the board, and you've checked off and you've met your minimum standards. However, if not, then we got to start making a plan to get to tier 1 across all those different segments, right? But in the emergency management, as it is kind of lists here with roles, responsibilities, training, drills, and tabletops, we have to know the national standards that we're basing everything off of. What are the best practices? Are we using information that's coming out of the Department of Ed and RIM's office? Are we using something out of the state office? Is it a nonprofit? What is the national best practice that we're using? And then does every person there know their role and their responsibility when said incident hits, right? And how are we training them to do that? If you're a district or a school that, maybe you're a private independent or a charter school that has 30, 40 employees, you have the ability to train all of those employees at one time. You have a district like the last one I left with 2,500 employees. I, as one person, it's impossible to train all of those people. So you become reliant upon training softwares and different systems out there that to standardize the training, to test the people, to make sure that they're all in compliance and that they understand what they are going to do. And then as you start advancing, and FEMA has a great course around developing drills and tabletops and exercises in the whole pattern to go through. But as you get your people trained and people understand what their roles and responsibilities are, then you're able to start doing some tabletop exercises with leadership and then start rolling that out into a full scale exercises. I know, again, soup du jour active shooter, people believe and think that law enforcement is going to show up and, oh, everything's taken care of. And that couldn't be any further from the truth. They're going to take care of the investigation, the crime scene, the murder investigation, but the students are yours and they should be yours. You do family reunification every single day, every day. You're the expert at that. So own that, keep that, be in charge of that, and make sure that you have that whole thing all together with the roles, responsibilities, and that people are tested on that. And then you circle back through and you fill those gaps that you identified through the drills to mitigate anything in the future.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you had said leading practices, and I want to give these resources and then allow a little bit more time for questions. But passk12.org, of course, is the website for PASS, and there you will find the guidelines for schools. And in those guidelines, you will find self-assessment checklists. But on that website, you'll also find white papers that help you understand some technologies that caution you in the application of technologies and move all the way even into emergency drills. So you'll find a variety of those resources right at passk12.org. Schoolsafety.gov, which just passed its 4th anniversary, came into being not long after the Marjory Stoneman Douglas incident, and probably because of that, and now is the federal repository for school security and emergency planning resources. And that is an entity that has endorsed the PASS guidelines. That is an entity that helps us with grant funding. There's going to be a lot of good information to find there. REMS, and I think you referred to that earlier, Kevin, is Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools. And they have higher education help and K through 12 help. And the link that we've placed here for you today is the K through 12 help. There's more to be found there through the Department of Education. And finally, schoolsafety.gov is ultimately managed by CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure. Help me. Anyway, it's thank you. It's the federal government's entity that oversees everything in school security, and you'll find here at this particular link all of the tools and resources that they offer to you as well. It was just one too many acronyms lesson, having found that I reached my threshold of tolerance there. What other questions do we have?
Some great questions. I do have one final, I'll say the final Alyssa's Law question to kind of wrap that one up. But someone had asked, do the PASS guidelines have some insight on how to approach Alyssa's Law? Back to what you're talking about with our white papers and a lot of good information that's there. Is there anything you could point to for our audience to look for there?
The answer is no, yes, and yes. We're not going to have all of the specifics that will help you with every decision you ever make. But I will tell you, unless you know, as part of our technical committee, we are pounding away at trying to answer these things and publish white papers and adjust things so that when the next set of guidelines come out, version 7, we're even better than we were in version 6. And what I really like about this is that we sometimes have differing opinions. As you can imagine, if you put an architect, a consultant, a manufacturer, and a vendor, and a practitioner all in the same room, not everybody's going to agree. And so when I say we're hammering it out, it's sometimes hammer to forehead to try to say, how can we agree on what would be the leading practice in this particular setting? So that's where my yeses will end the answer to the question.
Excellent.
Les, I want to point out real quick. I know we keep talking about Alyssa's law, but let's not forget that laws are bare minimum, right? So as we address Alyssa's law, we're looking deeper into the communications and the standards. Paul talked a little bit about it earlier when he talked about your VoIP phones. If the network goes down, your VoIP phone doesn't work anymore. As we transition systems and looking at mass communications, we have to fortify and put redundancies in place for power outages. Currently, your server room at a school or a district has all kinds of redundant power. However, each of those individual switch closets, IDFs, so to speak, throughout the schools, they usually do not have redundant power. And when you install an IP-based intercom system and one of those switches goes out, you just lost your communication. So let's look at Alyssa's law, right? Let's look at all the laws, but those reminded is bare minimums, and make sure that we're not doing that, because again, we live in a world where this mass communications and physical security has not been mandated by life safety fire code. So all the power redundancies and the things that are in place for the fire alarm system are not necessarily 100% in on all the mass communication systems. So we just need to be cognizant of that when we're looking at anything dealing with Alyssa's law or communications in general.
Excellent. I want to change gears on this with a different question. And Kevin, I want to ask you this because you had provided our past technical committee with that recently with the survey that came back was published in Campus Safety. Question is, what are your thoughts on weapons detection systems? You feel they have a place in school? If so, where? I know that's a really challenging question right now, but I want to ask you to.
Yeah, no, that's a great one, and thank you, Les, for turning this into a half-day webinar. So the short answer is this: is there a place? Absolutely. Where's the place at? It depends. It depends on your student population. It depends on where you are in the country. It depends on your political environment. It depends on the mandates from the parents, the teachers. It depends on a lot of things. I will say this about weapons screening. That's another Wild West. There are federal standards. There are other standards in place. Make sure you're doing your homework. Make sure you are buying the product or the process or that follows your policy, that follows your best practices, that follows your budget, and
that your security team will support.
Yeah.
With that or any technology, make sure you pilot it.
Yes. Okay. We have looks like 1 minute or less. Might be a little bit risky to start another question. So I think this might be a good time for us to be looking at closing. Yep. I want to thank both of you. Absolutely fantastic presentation. Very challenging issue to look at all this complexity and put a team together to do this. Thank you so much for doing it. I want to thank all of our participants for signing up. and joining in today. And I will remind you that we'll follow up with your questions. Anything we weren't able to get to, we will follow up with these. So thank you. Wish all of you a wonderful summer and upcoming week and weekend. Bye.